Our next speaker is Mr. Ashok Alexander. Mr. Alexander has been in the public health sector for over 2 decades and is the founder-director of Antara Foundation, which is a leading maternal and child health NGO committed to delivering innovations in public health. A grassroots practitioner, he combines that perspective with business thinking and was the director with McKinsey for over 2 decades. Mr. Alexander also headed the Gates Foundation's India office for a decade, and his initiatives, Avahan, averted the spread of HIV infection in more than 6 lakh people in India. His mission is solutions at scale, and he is driven by the community. He's now applying that scale thinking to maternal and child health in northern states. Mr. Alexander, can we please have you on dais?
First, thank you very much for giving me credit for a number of things I haven't done, but I'll accept them. Thank you, Sanjay, very much for this invitation. When I went through the book, it was so erudite that I called him back and said, "Have you not mistaken me for someone else?" But he insisted it was me, and perhaps it is my so-called grassroots knowledge which may come to play in my remarks today. It is a peculiar career I've had. 20 years in McKinsey and Company, followed by 10 years working with commercial sex workers, and 10 years now working with the very poorest mothers and their children in Madhya Pradesh, has given me, in fact, a view from the ground, which is what I'll try to go into. I'll say it right up front. Sanjay has come up with an alternative agenda, and it's brilliant. I need not say more than that. Anyone who touches this book will know that it's not only a labor of love, but the sweep of the book, the number of topics he covers, the data that goes behind it, and always the sense of deep concern that permeates the book is something amazing. I'm enthralled by the book. In my modest way, I'd like to talk about public health, because that's a domain I worked in, and suggest not an alternative agenda, but perhaps an alternative way of looking at public health delivery at the bottom of the pyramid. Sanjay has touched upon this in his book, but he hasn't dwelt on it, I might say. Before I get to it in the end, I'll go with my McKinsey training and tell you right up front what that thesis is. The thesis is that the problems of the very poorest in our country can be understood and solved not by policymakers, not by academics, not by people who opine and write in newspapers, but only by those very communities who live with that problem. To me, this is not theory, because this is what I've learned working with sex workers, working with pregnant and lactating women today. But let me not jump too far ahead of the story, but just briefly recap some of the things that Sanjay has said. On paper, if you look at India's health system, per se, if you look at it from high above, it's a health system that looks pretty decent. If you look at it, you have 2.2 health workers for every single village in India, for every 1,000 people. You have a policy framework which exists. You have a number of programs in place, and so on and so forth. So on paper, nothing can be said, let's improve the structure of the health system. It's in the implementation of those programs that we run into difficulties. But look, let's not make too fine a point about this. Where have we ended up after all of this? And these problems didn't come up yesterday or day before. They started somewhere in the late 40s of the last decade. From the very beginning, no government, no leadership has understood the importance of public health And it's like saying there's a dinosaur in the room and none of us have got it. We've accepted this as a pathetic way of life that we must accept, if only because it affects someone else, someone whose lives are very different. So let's for a moment try and understand why that happens. If you look at India's health outcomes, Sanjay has spent a lot of time going in through it. And you could throw a dart, if you want to, at anything that he said, and you hit some absolutely lamentable statistic. Here are just three that stand out to me as the saddest of them all. The neonatal mortality rate in India is 22, right? 63% of all deaths under the age of 5 happens in that 4-week period after a child is born. If you look closely at that, actually 70% of that happens in the first 10 days, and another 70% in the first 48 hours. So we have children dying much earlier than they should, to put it very, very roughly. Maternal mortality rate of 113. And I think the saddest statistic of all, our children, 30 to 35% of them are malnourished. And if you go by the 3 ways malnourishment, which is a layman's term, is measured, stunting, which is the most important and dastardly form of malnourishment, is close to 35%. 1 in 3 of our children is stunted. That means 1 in 3 adults is stunted. So this is something I won't dwell on it any further. Let's go quickly to what needs to be done, therefore. So if you look at the health structure and you look at its interventions, as many as there are issues, there are solutions. And you can group them any which way. You can say India doesn't spend enough, let's spend more. Our facilities are terrible, let's improve the facilities. And so on and so forth. Our policy framework around, let's do that. Let's train the frontline workers. Let's do all manner of things. Now, how do you make sense of this? How do you arrive at a cogent strategy? It's impossible to do, really, because that will vary by state, by region, by location, by population. So it's not an easy task in any circumstances. But I would venture to say that there's one assertion I can make that holds true in any village in India, in any marginalized population in India, and it's it's the strangest truth, which is the most ignored today, that if you want to solve the problems of maternal and child health, for example, you have to talk to that woman who lives in that tiny hamlet somewhere and says, what prevents you from breastfeeding? It's not that people haven't told her the importance of breastfeeding, what gets in the way of her breastfeeding. So if you get at it this way, if you ask the question in this form, you will probably get an answer that the policymakers and the pundits of all kinds have never even dreamt of. So this is the approach that I think, I won't say no one takes this approach, but it's not a common approach. I learned this early on in my career when I worked with sex workers, and I told the sex worker the obvious thing, you need to use condoms. And she said, I know about condoms, this is my trade. So I said, you'll die if you don't use condoms. She said, I would. That would be a long life if I died after 10 years. So I said, what do you really want then? She said, we need freedom from violence. And making that link between violence and HIV transaction and so on and so forth, the program went viral. Today, the women I work with, I ask them a question now. I don't tell them what I think should be the answer. I ask them what is their problem that they face, and you get very, very, very answers I at least was not familiar with earlier. So what we are doing really is that if you look at a public health system, and if you look at a set of solutions, you can look at solutions on the supply side and solutions on the demand side. Solutions to deal with facilities and so on, and solutions to deal with communities. Now, if we break these up, there's an undeniable logic which is to looking at solutions that to problems that arise and solutions that can be implemented only at the village level. There's an inherent logic to this which is actually very, very simple. If you have a woman dying in an inadequate primary health center because of postpartum hemorrhage, which is very intense, the major reason for that is that her anemia levels were very high. And if her anemia levels are so high, it is a predictor of PPH happening. Now, why did that woman have to end up in that hospital? She ended up in the hospital because she didn't get proper antenatal care. Now, why didn't she get proper antenatal care is the question. Because the data on her wasn't in the books and the registers that the frontline workers carried. And why didn't they carry those? Because those frontline workers come from two branches of government and they don't talk to each other. And so on and so forth. All of the causes of mortality that happen in primary health centers and the terrible facilities that we see all over India are problems that can be prevented easily, not with any great difficulty, at the level of the village. Why would we go and improve facilities? That's a tremendous thing to do, but why would we imagine that is the solution? These horrible facilities, I use that word, have been inherited over a period of decades. That problem won't go away overnight. A problem at the village level might. Now let me go a little further with this. If you break this up, if you can visualize a tree of some kind, if you look at the impact and you break it up into supply-side solutions and demand-side solutions, if you look at supply-side solutions, there are two. You can say there's a whole bucket of things that means you improve infrastructure, do better training of frontline staff. But there's one which is extremely important. I don't know how many people pay attention to it. I call it isolating the risk. Pretend for a moment that you're a whole group of pregnant and lactating mothers. It's actually difficult to do, but let's pretend for a moment that you are. And this may be roughly the population. It's larger than the population you'd find in a village of 1,500. You might find 30 or 40 such women. The point is that only 3 or 4 of those women are at high risk. These are high risk beneficiaries, high risk women, simply because of levels that we spoke about, because of all manner of things. Similarly, if there are 30 or 40 newborns, only 4 or 5, not even that, are at high risk. The rest of them are in very challenging situations, but these are the people who might die very soon, who might suffer for sure very, very soon. And you need to, in a health system, be able to first get to those. This is not as easy as it sounds. It's a classic needle in a haystack problem. If you work in villages, you'll know that. The government protocol requires that the ASHA worker travels from houses 1 to 9 on the first day, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, and you get the idea. It's a linear walk. The dying person may be in house number 52. It's an easy solution, isn't it? But this isolation of risk is a crucially important thing. Now, this is not as easy as it sounds. So, you have registers. I'm assuming everyone knows this thing about 3 frontline workers in every village in India. I think that's all we need to. One is a nurse, one is a community mobilizer, the other manages a creche. These 3 women come from 2 wings of government up in New Delhi, Women and Child Development and Health, and they don't talk to each other. So they have different registers at the village level. They have data records which are the same. The house number 52 is house number 76 and the other person's registers. The data cannot talk to each other. The solution is very simple. If you tell this to the women, they're not stuck in New Delhi. They are just normal human beings who talk to each other. They share their registers. And soon enough, we had a protocol called the AAA kind of method, where they used bindis on maps, went to the house which was having a problem, and had quick action taken. The changes in the statistics of high-risk pregnancies detected is dramatic, 3 to 4-fold improvement in those. We made an app out of it, it was even more dramatic. But let me keep this aside for the time being. Let's get to the demand side of the equation. Now we are talking about communities. The question is squarely this. Can you picture that woman whose face is covered by a ghungat, whose voice cannot be heard, and who has no control over the fate of her young child who is dying at her breast? I'm not exaggerating. These are situations I have dealt with and we deal with all the time. How do you create an active, aware consumer from that woman? How is that possible? It is indeed possible if you ask her, what are the problems that come in your way? Let me tell you of a real situation. A woman called Athro. She must have been 25 or 26. We went to see her, and it's in a very small village in MP, because she had twins, and both the twins had died. One was stillborn, the other died soon after birth. The primary health center, in any case, was a long way away. She would have to be carried up a hill to get anywhere near there. And she was in the practice of going to the local Baba for all advice, who said, no, relax, you're fine. Eat this seed or paste or something and you'll be perfectly fine. The Asha worker had come once in her 9 months of pregnancy, way back, and she was simply not in anyone's records. If you look at this sequence of events, you will see a systematic set of barriers that prevails in rural areas. Now, these barriers, we collected some data from a small sample set, but it'll give you an idea. If you categorize basic levels of awareness itself, the basic level of awareness a woman should have, that if she misses her menstrual period, she's likely to be pregnant. A woman who must be aware of her menstrual health and very, very many other aspects, that is completely missing in 51% of the women that we work with. Completely missing. So it's not very easy for a woman to learn about these things and seek treatment on her own. The prevalence and the influence of Babas in the places we worked is 56% was in the high category. In fact, Babas held sway in terms of predicating the health behavior of these women. Migration was 32% in the places we lived in, but there's another aspect, which is the scatter of villages. You have the system, where one house is on one hill, the other house may be on a second hill, two more in the third hill. Where is the notion of aggregating people, which is required in a public health intervention? And gender, of course, had its whole plays itself out at every level. So how would it work? How could it work? How is it working? Let me say. Picture Athro, the same woman. Picture her, that there is a women's group in the village who has informed her in once a month meetings where the women get together that you are likely to be pregnant, you missed your period, you should see the Asha worker, who also attends that meeting. She's diagnosed pregnant, she's diagnosed as having twins, she goes through 3 ANC checkups. It is found out that her anemia levels are low, she gets her iron and folic acids. She has an institutional delivery, so rather than rush with her on the back 4 people, she is taken 2 days early to the institution for a safe delivery. All of these solutions are very, very doable and are being practiced. I won't go on much longer because it's a topic I feel very strongly about. But I would say this. I'm not saying anything new. There are organizations and programs like the work that Abe and Rani Bang have done in Gachiroli on home-based newborn care, led by community. The well-known Ekjut program is also there. I think if I'm positing something perhaps new to what these great programs have done, it's the integration of the supply and demand sides. If you look carefully, you have programs that are very strong on the supply side. They work with the supply side of the system. They imagine that the the community member is this helpless individual. You have to do good things for her. Then you have some who deal with the community side, and they kind of mobilize communities. Often a lot of data is missing from their efforts. To mobilize the two so that Athro sits in that meeting of the three frontline workers, that community surrounding her hut adopts her and works with the supply side of it. These are modalities which are very possible. I won't just say they are possible. My experience with this, when we worked with the sex workers and talked about violence, they came up with solutions, and soon it was a tidal wave. If we are credited with having 600,000 infections averted, it had nothing to do with us. It was all about that tidal wave that couldn't be stopped. And that same thing can and should happen. There's enough of these prescriptions about supply side solutions and so on. Let's do all of that. But let's make sure that the final solution that is done is through the gates of the village. The solution lies inside the village. It's not solutions that have to be brought in to any village. Thank you very much.